Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and cookbook author, and my 4th book is coming out this fall. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Avery Ruzicka, the founder and head baker of Manresa Bread in the San Francisco Bay Area. Avery is known for her bread as well as her laminated pastries, and she's built Manresa Bread into a respected player on the baking scene. She's a baker who is deeply passionate about process and details, as you'll hear in our conversation. On today's episode, Avery walks us through a baked good that I've long wanted to discuss on the show, Kouign-Amann. Peeps, I will say, this is not a recipe for beginners, but with Avery's advice, you might be tempted to tackle this at home. You're going to hear exactly how this deliciously layered pastry is made, and not only that, you're going to understand why each step is crucial to the process. Stay tuned for our chat. Thank you to Plougre Premium European-style butter for supporting today's show. As some of you know, I've been a big fan of Plougre for some time now, and was introduced to it at my very first bakery job when I was just a newbie baker. Fast forward to today, I'm a professional baker, cookbook author, and recipe developer, and I continue to rely on Plougre for all my baking needs. My fridge is always stocked with Plougre sticks and solids. I especially love that Plougre contains 82% butter fat. The higher butter fat content means less moisture and more fat, and as bakers know, fat equals flavor. Plougre butter is also slow churned, making it more pliable and easy to work with. I do a lot of baking this time of year for work and for myself and my family. Comfy bakes like my pistachio chocolate anytime buns and cinnamon sugar buttermilk donut holes, and I always reach for Plougre unsalted butter. I've also been making a lot of yeasted breads lately, and I love the buttery flavor Plougre adds to my dough. Plougre Premium European-style butter is the perfect choice from professional kitchens to your home kitchen. Ask for Plougre at your favorite grocery store or visit plougre.com for a store locator and recipes. Guess what the next issue of Cherry Bomb magazine is all about? Paris. Whether you're headed to Paris this year, dreaming of Paris, or just a Francophile at heart, you're going to love this issue. Get recommendations from She's My Cherry Pie faves like Dory Greenspan and Zoe Bakes. Meet the coolest Parisians around and learn about their restaurants, shops, bars, and bakeries. And meet some fascinating expats who changed their lives when they moved to the City of Light. You can subscribe now at cherrybomb.com or pick up an issue at your favorite local bookstore, magazine shop, or gourmet store. You can find a complete list of stockists at cherrybomb.com. Team Cherry Bomb is on the road this summer, and they might be coming to a city near you. They're hitting cities from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon for special dinners, networking events, and even Women Who Grill celebrations. It's all part of the Cherry Bomb Summer Series. Learn more and get your tickets at cherrybomb.com. Let's check in with today's guest. Avery, so happy to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk Kouign-Amann and so much more.
I'm so excited to be here.
You're originally from North Carolina, and you grew up in a family with a lot of cooking and baking going on, and even bread making. Can you tell us, about an early food memory, be it baking, be it cooking, that was, burned into your brain or your stomach, totally in a good way?
Absolutely. My parents were not from North Carolina, and I think that baking traditions for us were a lot about connecting with family, even though we were kind of our own little island of family. So it was how we talked about grandparents, et cetera, who were maybe up in Chicago versus North Carolina. And my mom's side of the family is Danish. We grew up making æbleskivers, which are kind of like a little Danish pancake. And we would always have them for Christmas. And so it was very, very magical because, all that anticipation of Christmas Day. And then we were a family that you didn't open presents until after breakfast. It was very thrown into that mix of just joy, excitement, anticipation. And because it was kind of a labor-intensive process, we didn't have them pretty much any other time of the year.
Would you say that the kinds of things maybe that you were either making around the holidays or just making in general that your mom and dad were making for you, that they influenced the kind of either the baking that you do today or more specifically the kind of baker you are today?
I would say, I think what they influenced first and foremost was why I started cooking and baking. My parents were very curious people. when I was going to go to university and was trying to decide what I wanted to study, my dad kind of said, don't worry about where it's going to take you. Focus on what you're interested in. And I think with baking and cooking in general, my parents were always curious people. So we were trying new things or trying new kinds of cuisine. And also being in North Carolina, like early 90s, North Carolina was a very different place than it is now. And my parents had moved there from Chicago. So that was also a lot of the ways that we explored the world that wasn't necessarily accessible at that time. They definitely influenced me in terms of the kind of food I cook or bake at this point. I think it had more to do with interest in where ingredients came from. We always went to the farmers markets. That was a big part of our weekly routine, knew the farmers, got our eggs from this vendor, got our apples from the apple farmer who comes down from the mountains in North Carolina, that kind of thing. So that's, I think, the biggest draw for me is really understanding where things come from and seeking it out.
Now, I know you didn't start out as a food peep. You studied poli-sci when you were in college, and then you went to France while in college and kind of fell in, on a junior year abroad situation, ended up staying longer than that. But you kind of fell in love with food and with the idea of writing about it while you were there. But I wondered, when you're eating all of that incredible, French pastry and bread, I know you were thinking, gosh, I can't wait to write about this. Were you also thinking, gosh, I can't wait to make this?
At the beginning, I really wasn't. I moved back from France. I had a summer before I was going to finish my last year of university. And so I thought, well, if you're going to write about food, it would be great to get some experience in a kitchen. And then that's when I really fell in love with, and looking back, I can also see the parallels of toiling away on your own, right? You might spend months working on something and then decide, I don't like anything about this. I've got to throw it all out and start again. And when you're in a kitchen atmosphere, especially if you're in one where people are caring, you're not just kind of turn and burn. You're hearing from your chef about where this food came from, or you're going to the farmer's market. So there's all this creativity, but then the actual element of creating and sharing is pretty quick, right? It's pretty instantaneous. So you get to cook off this dish and then you get to give it to a diner and you get to see their experience with it. And so that was what led me to feeling oh my gosh, cooking, this is incredible. This is such a high, right? I think there were all of these subconscious connections to food when I lived in Europe, but then they didn't all come together until after I moved back to the United States.
So you ended up going to California after school and working for Chef David Kinch at his 3 Michelin-starred Manresa. And the rest is history. You're the founder and the head baker of Manresa Bread. Would you say that at this point, when you were sort of given this opportunity to begin Manresa Bread, and I assume, was David your partner?
Yeah. So,
co-owner?
I think what is good to tell people about or share in my story is that the way that it came about, because I met David and I'm back in New York right now for the first time since 2019. We just went to visit Chelsea Market and I was reminiscing that I think maybe even the last time I've been in Chelsea Market was the second time I met David. He had just won his James Beard Award and the Beard Awards were still in New York and he was hosting a dinner. And so I'd gone to help volunteer in the kitchen. And that's where I really kind of connected with David. And he had said, there's opportunities for people who are hardworking, who are, you're the kind of person who we would love to have in the restaurant. But that open invitation really just meant more like a stage, which was an unpaid position, which I couldn't afford to move to California without a job. So a friend of mine had heard, fast forward another 6 months, maybe more, that Manresa was hiring in the front of the house. So that is at what point I decided to move from New York on a whim. I was actually down in North Carolina on vacation, and I flew from North Carolina to California, and I took the food runner position. What I just want to share with people as they're wanting to pursue careers is that you really have to look for every little edge, every little opening. And so what ended up happening was I took the position as a food runner, but I had my mornings free. And I kind of observed the bread, which was being made at that point by stages in the restaurant who didn't have any baking background and weren't particularly passionate about it. It was kind of a thing they had to get done. But I was I think I can make this better than it is very easily, without new equipment, without anything like that. I think I can improve it. And so I went to one of the chefs and said, could I come in and could I help a little bit? And they said, okay, let's see what happens. And so I came in and it got a little bit better. And then I slowly took that over and then things got better and better. And people started talking about the bread. And then I was still working in the front of house in the evening. So I was working for free in the morning making the bread. And then I was working in the evening as a food runner. And then we had a guest who said, would you like to sell the bread at the farmer's market? So then I started baking the bread and then working at the farmer's market. So they were 48-hour days, So in terms of given the opportunity, I think it's important to remember, like, you have to kind of create your own opportunities.
So I know the Manresa Bread project, which was for the farmers market, became Manresa Bread, which is the bakery. Would you say that already in those beginning moments you had like a dessert or baking style at that point professionally? Or was it more that once you were given this baby and got to raise it, that you realized, raise being the pun because bread, that you sort of came into your own in terms of, oh, this is an Avery bakery, this is an Avery baked good?
It kind of goes back to my desire and my curiosity about ingredients, which is what led me to want to work at Manresa in the first place. Was I wanted to work in a very fine dining atmosphere, and I wanted to work in a place that had a connection specifically to a farm or had their own farm. And I wanted to work in a place that seemed to have produced successful chefs from that restaurant. So Manresa had all of those things. You know, again, like if you're going to work for free or if you're going to put in the time, you want to work in a place that is leading in the direction you want to go. I was kind of honing in on my focus on ingredient, which, you know, is very important to what we do. So we mill our own flour. I was focusing on kind of like simplicity. I wasn't a pastry chef. I was a baker and a cook. And so I have great respect for true pastry chef who focuses primarily on plated desserts, entremets, things like that. But that had not been my wheelhouse whatsoever. Like, it's something that I've learned a lot more about, but I would say that my style really tends more toward sourdough fermentation. So when we opened, I would call myself like more of a boulangerie when we first opened versus a patisserie. And that was when I looked to inspiration, you know, abroad as well. Like, I looked at the baking styles of bakers who then made pastries. So when we first opened, we had brioche and Kouign-Amann and laminated doughs, but those are all dough still. So everything was primarily dough-based, or it tied back to a singular ingredient. So, for example, our chocolate chip cookie is a whole grain chocolate chip cookie that's made with 100% whole grain. I think so. I think it was starting to develop.
We'll be right back.
Hi, everybody. This is Kerry Diamond, founder of Cherry Bomb and host of Radio Cherry Bomb. You know about our podcast, but do you know we host lots of fun events across the country? We are hosting a special event in Las Vegas this Monday, June 24th from 6 to 8 p.m. Join me and some of the city's top female culinary talent to celebrate our new podcast miniseries, Destination Cherry Bomb, which is dedicated to all things food and travel. We'll have networking, a panel conversation, and great food and drink. We'll be at the beautiful La Fontaine restaurant located inside Fontainebleau, Las Vegas. Come meet other members of the Vegas Bomb Squad and learn about the folks shaping the city's culinary landscape. Tickets are $30 and include the latest issue of Cherry Bomb magazine, plus all bites and sips. Head to cherrybomb.com to get your tickets today, or check out the link in our show notes.
Now back to our guest. I just want to say that some people do say Kouign-Amann.
Yes, definitely.
And do you believe that one can use either?
I do believe that. I think that that's absolutely fine.
Good. When I was listening to you talk and researching, I was like, who's Kouign?
Yeah.
Who's Kouign? Where's the queen? I heard that it's the most popular item at the bakery, maybe besides the monkey bread. Is that still true?
Yes, that's still true.
Okay.
That's still true.
And just what is it?
So a Kouign-Amann is a laminated dough, a type of viennoiserie that originated from Brittany. So Brittany is extremely famous for its dairy products, including its butter. Kouign-Amann is really a butter cake. That's sort of what that boils down to, and which means that in a laminated dough is made up of two things: your dough or your de trempe and your butter, which is or your barrage. And so a Kouign-Amann is like a small cake made out of these two components. And the quality of the butter and the flavor of the butter is really accentuated, if you will, by the inclusion of sugar. Unlike a croissant dough that has all of those things in its initial dough, a Kouign-Amann typically has layers of sugar or additional layers of butter incorporated into the dough so that when you bite into it, the first thing that hits your tongue is the flavor of butter and sugar.
And tell us about the kind of gooey is maybe not the right word, but custard-like. Tell us
Absolutely.
about the center.
Yeah, so because you are layering dough, which has butter laminated into it with layers of sugar, in the baking process, you fold typically, or sometimes Kouign-Amann can be shaped a couple different ways. We fold our Kouign-Amann. They can also be rolled and cut in slices, and both are pretty traditional. You'll see both in Brittany. But what that does is it captures a quantity of kind of like the butter that is melting as well as the moisture that's evaporating out. So with a plain croissant, the evaporation of the water in the butter will kind of like help with the height of the croissant, the shape of the croissant, but it also kind of evaporates out. But with the shaping of your Kouign-Amann, where you fold things over, some of that moisture doesn't evaporate out, and so it goes back in and it creates this custardy center. I lean more towards savory than sweet. And so what I love about our Kouign-Amann is that we make a unique dough compared to our croissant dough. So it is a very simple dough. Our croissant dough has eggs, it has a pouliche in it, it's yeasted. So it's a much more complex dough, including it has sugar in it. And then our Kouign-Amann dough is really just flour, milk, butter, salt, and yeast. And then the sugar only is incorporated in the lamination process. And I think it just really balances the whole thing. We also use all organic ingredients. And so we're using a granulated sugar, but it's an organic granulated sugar, which is a little bit larger of a granule size than a non-organic. And
is it also a little browner?
It is, very much so. And so it has a little bit more of a caramelized flavor already. And so I just think that they balance each other really nicely.
All right, let's talk about the recipe. So first of all, we're going to chill all of our dry ingredients. So we have our chilled, it's a high-protein flour, and we're going to add some yeast. Again, this is all going in the refrigerator. Instant, active, live.
Instant yeast, honestly, works really well. It's kind of like foolproof.
And then we're going to add some salt. Is it kosher salt?
It is kosher salt.
Okay. And we're going to put all that together and put that in you say the walk-in, but we'll say our refrigerator. And then we're going to spray a metal bowl. Why metal? Could it be a glass bowl?
It could be. I mean, if you're going to make this by hand, it doesn't have to be metal. That could be any bowl at home.
Okay, so we're going to spray, let's say, metal bowl. And I wondered if there's a particular kind of spray that...
You could put spray on a little bit of oil. And this is also if you're pre-scaling things. So at the bakery, we pre-scale things because we try to be efficient. The reason that we refrigerate the dry ingredients is because we want to control the fermentation process as much as possible. For the home baker, depending on the size of Kouign-Amann dough that you're planning to make, as long as you're working with ingredients that are not, if you're working on a very hot day, perhaps you would want to chill things down. But other than that, that's really where that step comes in for us. And so the reason that we spray the bowl for our non-dry ingredients is so that they can be prepped and ready and at room temperature. If you're just going to make this directly, you don't even need to pre-scale those things.
So we have our metal bowl. Maybe we sprayed it, maybe we haven't. We have some softened butter in there and some barley syrup. Tell us what brand of barley syrup. Could we buy it and why are we putting it in?
Absolutely. You could use barley syrup. You could use a rice syrup. Yeast wants some sugar. Yeast will, if you think about our sourdough bread, there is sugar in flour, like in very small quantities to some degree. But when we're making this dough, because our Kouign-Amann dough doesn't have sugar in it, adding the barley malt syrup or adding some sort of rice syrup, you could add a little bit of maple syrup. It's just a little bit more to help with the activity of the dough. I also think that it helps balance. So barley malt has a malted flavor. And so that has a role in kind of creating this fully rounded flavor of the dough. But any kind of malted or syrup of that sort that kind of just depth, amber kind of flavor,
Almost, could you use
Lyle's
golden syrup?
Oh, yeah. You could use golden
like...
syrup. If you like the flavor of molasses, which I do, you could use a small amount of molasses, kind of like anything that's a slightly darker palette of sugar flavor.
And so we're going to put all of these ingredients, the dry ones and then these wet ones, along with some water into our stand mixer. And we're going to mix about 11 minutes, beginning on a very low speed and then raising it a little, but still keeping it low. Is that because you're using a Hobart and it's big? Or if I was at home, would I also want to keep it very low?
You don't want to overdevelop your dough. You're looking for a window pane texture, but you're going to be doing a series of folds to laminate the dough. If you overdevelop your dough, you're going to end up with something that will tear a lot. And because we're already using, in our case, in the bakery, a higher gluten flour, we don't want to overdevelop that gluten. If you're at home and you're using a lower gluten, like an AP flour, then you're just still going to look for a window pane.
Do you want to tell the listeners just in case they've forgotten?
Sure. So when we make bread or a laminated dough in this case with wheat flour, wheat contains gluten, and in the process of even just introducing some sort of moisture to gluten, so some sort of water content to flour, gluten will start to develop. And then when you actually mix your dough, what you're basically doing is folding over and over again that gluten structure on itself, which is creating the strength for your dough, which will, depending on the style of dough that you're making, it will definitely lend structure. It will be a part of the mouthfeel of your final product, the shape, and also it will impact the fermentation. So if you don't develop enough gluten, then in the fermentation process, the yeast will basically break down too much of the gluten, and that might be when you have a loaf that doesn't really rise nicely, etc. So when we are looking for a window pane, what we're going to do is grab kind of a roll-sized piece of dough. You want something that has some size to it. And then you're going to slowly tease those two sides apart so that you end up with a very thin piece of dough stretched out. And if you can do that without the dough kind of like shredding or ripping, basically so that you can see through it as if it were a window pane, then you have developed typically enough gluten for you to move on to the next part of the recipe.
That's what we're looking for
That
after
is.
this 11 minutes-ish. And once we're done with this and we see our window pane, do we immediately sheet?
No, you're going to relax the dough. What we do in the bakery setting is we take that dough. It's not that we sheet, I guess we would use the word that we sheet it in the sense that we stretch it to its pre-shape, if you will, before we refrigerate it. But you can do that by hand. And we even do it by hand sometimes with the Kouign-Amann just because it's not as big of a dough book. But that is really just to help you get to the shape you want it for the lamination process.
So is it like a big rectangle?
It is. So unlike perhaps a sourdough loaf where you're going to finish the mixing process and then you're going to take it out of the mixing bowl and you're going to put it into another bowl to ferment, and it's going to be kind of in a round shape. In this case, we're kind of stretching it out. That does two things as well. It gets you kind of closer to where you want to be. It also slows the fermentation because when you have dough rounded on top of itself, there's more dough mass altogether, which is going to keep the fermentation happening at a quicker rate because the interior of that dough mass is going to be warmer, right? So when you spread out the dough and flatten it, you're creating more surface space, so it's going to chill down quicker, which is what you want because this is a multi-step process.
So we put it into the freezer at this point or the refrigerator?
We
at
put
this
ours
point?
into the freezer, but I would say for the home, you could do either at home. It really depends on your freezer size as well and the quantity of dough you're making. But what you're trying to do is slow down the process because you don't want to go directly from making the dough to starting to lock in the butter. You want to relax the dough, and you also want to start to develop a little bit of flavor. So we use our dough in a professional baking setting. You're going to take doughs in and out of the freezer multiple times just because of the volume of product we're making. In a home situation, you could freeze it because you want to make this a multi-day process and not be overwhelmed. Or you could refrigerate it as long as your refrigerator is really cold.
And just kind of refrigerate it for an hour or so.
Or depending,
Or
or
overnight.
it could be overnight. I would say that if you're going to mix this dough at 8 a.m., you don't plan to lock it in till the next day at 8, you probably want to freeze it because most of our home fridges are going to get opened and closed a million times in a day.
And so the dough will rise too much.
Too much. And you want to maintain, you don't want to exhaust the yeast.
I get it.
At this point.
Now we're going to make our butter block.
Yes.
Tell us about how we would do this at home.
Yes.
As opposed to how you guys do it in the bakery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think when making it at home, it's a great thing to do like after you've mixed your dough because you're kind of like still in baking mode and you're phasing out the steps. You would have had to pull butter for the recipe of the Kouign-Amann to begin with. I find it easiest when making a butter block at home to take room temperature butter and parchment paper and basically cut the block up into kind of like flatter pieces. So I guess it depends on if you're going to buy a 1 pound block or if you're going to buy a pound broken into 4 sticks. If you're buying butter in 4 stick pieces, that's totally fine. You would just take each one of those and cut that in half or use those at a softer, quite soft, and put them between the parchment and fold the parchment to roughly the size that you're looking for. Typically, when we're laminating products at home, we're looking for the butter to be anywhere between half to a third the size of the dough. So that's kind of a good guide to start with. And so the recipe size that you would do at home wouldn't be so large that you would need kilos and kilos of butter. You might maybe be using 1 pound to 2 pounds of butter.
You kind of want soft, but not too soft.
You
when you're
want
doing
it. You
this.
do not want it to be like a butter that you'd be able to whip. So if you're thinking of making a cake, this butter should be colder than cake butter. When I think about making a cake, you want butter to be basically like just this side of mayonnaise state, if you will. If you've ever mixed a cake where your butter was still too cold and you start to put the sugar in and you're supposed to be creaming butter and sugar and the butter is sort of clumping, that's kind of the temperature you want this to be because I like to use a rolling pin. And so you take a piece of parchment paper. Ideally, you're going to use a roll of parchment that, you buy like the Saran Wrap brand or something that not everybody that's a home baker has access to pre-cut parchment. So I think it's easy to use parchment that, just the full roll, and then you can kind of fold it to the dimensions you need. And then you're going to put the butter between those two pieces. If you have a small size baking sheet tray that has a rim to it, you can also use that. That's kind of a nice way to do it as well because that kind of acts as a mold for the butter.
You can almost line that with plastic
exactly.
so that you can get it.
Exactly. And then you can almost like do it a little bit by hand.
Yep.
The most important thing that you're looking for here is a consistent thickness. That's where I think that making a slightly larger recipe versus a slightly smaller recipe for laminated doughs at home is better, because when we get to the lamination phase, it's all about getting the dough and the butter very similar textures. And when you have butter, I think that's sometimes something that people home baking and trying to do lamination by hand run into trouble with, is that it's too small of a recipe with too little butter. So the butter gets too warm too quickly. And then that's where you start to break your butter, or your butter shatters. And then when you bake the croissant or bake the whatever, all this butter leaks out of it. And also, you go through a lot of work to do laminated dough at home. Why not make a slightly larger recipe?
So once we've made sort of our butter block and it's at the right size,
Yes.
and our dough, let's say it's in the refrigerator,
Yes.
do we return the butter to the refrigerator?
You do.
To try to get it to the same temperature
Yes.
as our dough?
You absolutely take the butter and put it in the fridge, and you're going to want to give it some time there. And that's why I think it's a nice idea to make your butter block basically right after making your Kouign-Amann dough, because both of these things are done. They're sitting in the fridge, and now at your own kind of like discretion, you can start the process of lamination. So typically the dough is the thing that's kind of at the ambient texture. You're going to more or less work with the dough directly from the fridge. And so it's the butter that you're going to take out first, or again, depending on the size you're working with, you want to basically have the butter be just starting to be pliable. What I think of, or what I like to work with my team, is it should be malleable is a good word. Like, it should not be rock hard. It should be where you could almost slightly bend it and it wouldn't break in half.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody's kitchen's going to be a little different, all of those things. So you typically will pull that out and wait a little while. It could be like 15 minutes or so, and then pull your dough out.
And then the dough is a large rectangle. The butter is also a rectangle that will be rested evenly on the dough.
Correct.
And then we will fold up our sides.
Correct.
In our short sides as well, or maybe we'll just pinch our short sides.
Typically, I mean, ideally what you want to do is you want to make your butter block in reference to your dough. You can really kind of make that your own. If you make, let's say, a kilo of dough, you could stretch that to a shape that feels comfortable for you to work with, and then you should shape your butter block. I would shape that in reference. And so once you've done that, I like to put my butter block in the center of the dough, and I actually like to use a pizza cutter to cut the two pieces to each side, and I really prefer for it to be the full length of the dough. So the short side, I don't pinch the sides. I just bring the two edge pieces, if you will, that are the longer pieces. I marry them on top of the butter block.
So you fold from the long sides of the rectangle.
I fold, but in fact, I don't even fold. I cut and I set on top.
And so then it's just a thin, tiny seam.
In the center.
Yeah.
And
then
I
that,
actually push those together.
Yep, and then you're done.
And then you're
Yeah.
done. The reason I think that this is helpful is that you, as the laminator, now have a visual of each side of where your butter and your doughs meet. We want always for there to be dough, butter, dough. And then we're just increasing how many layers of dough, butter, dough we have, or in the case of the Kouign-Amann, dough, butter, or sugar. Exactly. And so by being able to see all the way around your dough and your butter, you're going to be able to see that your dough extends as far as your butter.
So you can still see the butter layer.
Correct. Because I've literally cut, instead of folding it over like a piece of
letter fold
exactly,
or something.
Exactly.
I get it. I get it. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Again, if we're at home, is this our first sprinkle of...
No, the first sprinkle. So at this point, what we've done is we've locked in the dough. Now we think of things in turns. So if you started with your book facing you long ways, like a letter paper...
Vertically as opposed to horizontal.
Yeah, vertically. You would then lengthen your dough with the rolling pin at that point. Mm-hmm. So you might go kind of like 1.5 to almost 2 lengths of your initial starting length. And then at that point, I would pivot my dough because it's easier to fold things.
Now it'll be vertical to you.
Exactly. And you're going to sprinkle your sugar on at that point because you want to sprinkle your sugar on the full length of the dough, and you need to lengthen the dough in order to be able to fold the dough.
Is the sugar, I'm sure you're not eyeballing it, but is it just like, I just need the sugar to cover this? I don't need to be like, I need 7 tablespoons.
No, you can do that to kind of your discretion.
Okay.
We do measure it because we want consistency.
Yep.
But it's one of those things that 100% of the sugar is not going to stick. You're going to have loss as you start to do the folding process. For 1,000 grams of dough, you're thinking probably like 100 grams of sugar per layer.
So our book has now been stretched out in
Correct.
front of us. It's facing us horizontally.
Yes.
We sprinkle it with sugar.
Yes.
We are now
We're going to fold it like a letter fold.
Now we do our letter fold.
We do a letter fold, correct. Because that way we're creating more layers. We're just
Yep.
continuously creating more layers. We do a letter fold instead of a book fold, especially because at home, if you're doing a book fold, that's a lot of layers. And so there's a lot more tension.
Can you just briefly tell us
Sure.
the difference between a letter and a book
Yes.
fold?
There's a lot of different ways people reference folds. And so some people use what seems like a simple term, which would be letter fold versus book fold. So a letter fold would be like when you're folding something in thirds to mail a letter, an 8x11 piece of paper that you fold halfway or 2/3 up, and then you fold the last third on top of it. So it's kind of like 2/3, 1/3.
Yep.
A book fold is equal parts into the center, and then you fold both sides over. So it's like you're thinking about kind of the way that a book closes. So you're creating a hinge basically in the center. And so instead of just creating 1, 2, 3 layers, you're creating
1, 2,
1, 2, 3, 4 over again.
But you guys are letter folders at this point.
For this product at this point, we
Okay.
are, yes.
We do a letter fold. When we letter fold, it's now going to be horizontal to us.
It is. I would recommend resting your dough at this point.
Okay.
So taking a quick break, because just like in the mixing process in the mixing bowl, or if you're mixing something by hand, you're developing gluten. Every time we fold the dough over itself, not only are we incorporating sugar and creating layers of butter and dough, but we're also creating tension within the dough. What I like to think of is that initial size that I started out with my book with just the butter inside of it. I kind of am constantly trying to go back to that size. That's like a good reference point. You want to give your dough a little bit of time. With a small amount of dough, it won't take very much time, but you kind of want to give yourself like 15 minutes, and you're going to put it back in the fridge.
So
15 to 20 minutes. You're not trying to ferment the dough. You're just trying to let the gluten relax a little bit.
So we have our first sprinkle. We've done a letter fold.
Correct.
Into
So it's
the
like,
fridge for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes.
Not even.
Okay.
Not even. So it's kind of, you think of it in 2 steps. So you created the layers by locking in the butter. Then you created the next layers by rolling out, sprinkling sugar, folding. And so that's 1, 2 now. And then you're going to go 3, 4. You're going to do it two more times. Typically, you're going to rest the dough again for a few minutes before you roll it out to cut your final shape.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, I love this so much. And each time we're doing
Each
that
time
sugar.
with sugar. Each time with sugar, yes.
Love.
And so each time you're just adding more and more sugar in there, and you're creating all of these very thin layers with sugar between the layers of butter and flour.
And the sugar mostly just, there's no like brushing water or brushing egg wash. You don't need it. The
none
sugar
of that.
mostly
But that's why you
sticks.
need to also relax your dough. Because if you get the dough too tight, you won't be able to roll the dough. So in the process of rolling the dough out, you need to be able to lengthen the dough so that the sugar has enough length to be incorporated into the dough. If you can't roll the dough because it's too tight, then the sugar's just going to sit there on top.
But just so I understand, we're never rolling on top of sugar.
No, we are. You are, because you have to lengthen. So
we lengthen before we letter fold.
the very first one, that is correct. The very first one, we locked in our butter.
Yep.
Then we had to lengthen.
Yep.
Then we put sugar on.
Yep.
And we folded.
Yep.
Now, before we can put more sugar on, we have to lengthen. So
when it comes out of the fridge from its rest,
it gets lengthened again. And so you're lengthening, basically that sugar is getting put in that was already in that last roll. You're lengthening that. Then you're sprinkling more sugar. And then you can roll your rolling pin back and forth over that.
Or you just fold it at that point.
Yeah. Your sugar should be kind of like being lengthened into it. We do not put 100% of the sugar just straight on. It's like you sprinkle a little bit, lengthen, and then sprinkle the rest. Now fold. Now chill. Now rest, lengthen a little bit, sprinkle, lengthen the rest of the way, fold.
Got you.
Yeah.
So there is a moment,
There is.
like each sugar application.
Each sugar application
is
is
broken
not
into 2.
correct.
One is rolling literally sugar
Correct.
into dough. One is lengthening
Correct.
dough that's been.
That's the way that my team makes our Kouign-Amann. That doesn't make or break it, but that is definitely how we do it. You're trying to emphasize how much sugar you can incorporate into the dough.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now we'll let our dough rest,
Yes.
relax before we're going to cut it. You're calling it a bicycle. I think we used to use it in the bakery I worked at to cut brownies. It's almost like an accordion.
It is.
Like of a million pizza cutters.
Yes,
Or like
a
a
rolling
pastry.
cutter.
Yeah, a rolling cutter. I love that. And that's what you are using to sort of cut
We do.
our shape into squares.
So what's nice about a bicycle cutter is that it is like an accordion and then it has a lock on it. So you can adjust that accordion. I recommend using a ruler because even though it appears as though you're stretching it in their equidistance, If you're a perfectionist, you have to sort of double check it against a ruler to make sure that each of the little cutters are equidistant apart. And then there's a little locking mechanism. And so you tighten that locking mechanism. And then for you to final shape your dough, you're going to repeat the very last process without any more sugar. So you're going to lengthen the dough, and now you're going to cut the dough. There is one more addition of sugar, and that's in the shaping process. So we take all of our little squares. So we just use the same, once we spread it out to like about 2.5 inches, we cut the dough one direction, then we cut the dough the other direction. And now we have 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch squares. Then we take those, we use a sheeter, but if we were working at home, then I like to stack those up. I take the sugar that maybe has not been incorporated throughout the process and I scrape that off my table, or you can just use fresh sugar. And before I actually shape the Kouign-Amann, I dip that into a little bit more sugar on both sides because you want one last layer of sugar. That's going to be the sugar that helps with the caramelization in the baking process. So you really want to make sure that it's like nicely coated.
Your favorite kind of rolling pin? Do you like handles? Do you like tapered?
I like handles for this dough because I think that you have better leverage for a stiffer dough with handles. I think it has to do a lot with the person, though, because things like your height, the height of your counter that you're working on, your arm strength, too, but all of those things, especially a person's height compared to their work surface, is going to create a different ability, like a point of leverage, if you will. And so I think that to some degree, I find that using a rolling pin with handles for a dough like this really allows you to get like up and over the dough because you're going to need to put some pressure on it, especially at the beginning. As you incorporate the sugar into the dough's going to relax because sugar absorbs moisture. So it pulls some of the moisture out of the dough, so it's going to eventually kind of like start to soften the dough. So the dough you started with versus the dough you finish with, that fully locked in, laminated, and now final cut of Kouign-Amann is going to be much more extensible than what you started with. So it gets easier as you do the work, but I think for this product, I like a rolling pin with handles.
And do you think you can buy that bicycle thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like
you can,
for home, because I'm just thinking home bakers need that for perfect brownies.
That's something that you can buy these days. I mean, number one, you can buy anything on Amazon,
yeah.
but I'm sure you can buy that, and they're not expensive.
Yeah, it's such a cool tool.
It is a cool tool, and it's not a sharp tool, so it's very useful, but it's also fairly safe. Because for a lot of laminated products, you want more of not a razor blade or like a sharp, X-Acto kind of thing because you want a really nice cut. But this one is a lot more forgiving, so you can just use the bicycle to cut it.
Each of our squares, we're going to dip both sides in sugar and then fold the squares into a flour. Is that basically just bringing each corner of the square into the center?
So there's multiple different ways, and I think this is where, depending on the kind of learning style, I think this is really helpful to like watch videos, things like that, because there are a lot of different ways to shape Kouign-Amann. You can do a very simple shape where you fold the corners in, kind of like one of those little
like origami.
Yeah, those little like
paper,
that told you who are you going to marry when you were in elementary school. So you can fold all the corners in, but you can also do a little bit more. And this is what we mean when we say fold into a flower. We start midway with 4 points. We start with the far left corner. We fold that in, and then you sort of fold halfway between each. So instead of folding just the 4 corners in, you're basically giving it double the quantity of fold. So you're folding that first corner in, then you're folding the center between these 2 corners in. Then you're folding the next corner. So you're overlapping the layers so that then when it opens, it sort of opens up a little bit more like a flower instead of it just being 4 points into the center.
Oh, that's so pretty. And the bakery you're freezing, do we need to freeze now? Do we need to proof
now?
No,
you could.
Could you bake off now?
You could not bake off now. You have to proof them. It is a yeasted dough. So if you can bake them off, things might have gotten a little out of hand. But you need to either freeze them or chill them if you wanted to wait to bake them. So you have that flexibility. Again, because I think laminating products at home can be, like, I personally would probably not try to go from start to finish with a laminated dough in one sitting. I would want to give myself some space. So maybe I'm laminating the night before and I'm shaping everything and then I'm just putting it in the fridge overnight. And then in the morning, I'm pulling them out. And the nice thing about Kouign-Amann is it has a very short proofing time. So it's a great thing to bake at home because things like ambient temperature or your proofing temperature, which can be a real difficulty when trying to make something like a croissant or pain au chocolat because it takes typically multiple hours for those things to proof. Kouign-Amann proofs in about 45 minutes to an hour, maybe an hour and a half max. It could be baked in a ring mold. It could be baked in a muffin pan. It's better to bake them in some sort of vessel because otherwise the folds will sort of come undone. But other than that, it really can just like sit out ready to bake in a warmish environment in anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour and a half.
Love that. So we're going to spray our rings. And I wondered, I know this is just what you're doing in the bakery, but what's the size? What's the brand?
Yeah.
And do you think, I don't have them at home, but do you think rings are better than a muffin tin?
So we use something that we would call like a mousse ring, and you can get those. A lot of the like Bake Deco, Matfer, which is more of a professional brand, but we use a Matfer ring. But it's really just a stainless metal ring that's open at the top and the bottom, and it's about 2 inches tall and about 2 inches wide. It's a taller ring versus a shallow ring. What this does is it gives it structure, and what I think is nice about baking something like a Kouign-Amann in a ring mold like that is that you have access from the top and the bottom. So you have to think this is a product that's literally coated in sugar and butter. So what happens when you combine butter and sugar? You make basically caramel. And what happens when caramel cools? It becomes very hard. And so exactly. And so one thing that is nice about having the ring mold is that, let's say you make it, you take it out, and you don't immediately take them out of that mold. You can run a paring knife all the way around it and pop it right out.
Our goal is caramelization, which I love. And you said we're putting our rings on a silpat line. I only will use parchment because I feel like it's too much insulation between the metal of my pan.
I don't think you're wrong about that. I think that in professional ovens,
it's different.
Power, the BTUs, are completely different than your home oven.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that parchment on a heavy, I would really recommend a heavy baking pan.
Yeah.
So not one of these super thin, lightweight things that people like to sometimes cook cookies on because they don't want their cookie to get very dark on the bottom, which is understandable.
Yeah.
We use a spray because that's just easier, but you could use any kind of oil. You could even use a little bit more butter.
What spray, just out of curiosity?
We use like a canola style.
Yeah.
It depends on what we're baking because different things have different heat temperature abilities. So for something like that, we're just kind of trying to create a barrier so that everything doesn't, there's some ability, especially when you think about
to
you're
pop
baking,
it out.
Exactly. And you're baking hundreds of them.
Right. And so the first ones might pop out easily, but the 100th
exactly.
one...
And that's one of those things where we sometimes bake something like that in batches, if you will, depending on especially if we're like thinking about a major holiday and we're going to bake hundreds and hundreds of Kouign-Amann at once. We might stagger the bakes because typically we have 2, maybe 3 at the very max, but traditionally or typically, even with multiple locations, we have 2 bakers for the pastry team. So they can only work so quickly.
Yeah.
So at home, that won't really be an issue. I think that muffin pans, if you're going to use a muffin pan, you want a very wide muffin pan. You do not. So some
almost like a jumbo?
Yeah. Or you want to just make sure you make a very small pastry. What you don't want to do is put if you're thinking of a very traditional muffin cup size with the sides come in toward, it's smaller at the bottom than it is at the top.
Tapered.
It's tapered. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just you really want to make sure you don't put a lot of dough in there because it will be very hard to get out.
So we're going to bake it. It's 370 when you're in the bakery. At home, is that 375 or is that 350?
It is 375. And then if you have convection, some people do, some people don't. If you do not have convection, I would go 375. Or at the very least, start my oven at 375. Really has to do with how well you know your oven.
Yep.
I always recommend for people to get one of those little oven thermometers that lives in your oven.
And it's about 17 minutes in the bakery.
Maybe 22 max. It has to do, again, with how big you've cut them, how much dough we're talking about. This is a product you want to fully bake because you want all the textural differences. And so under baking this product, some things are good, very lightly baked, but I think that this is a product where you really want to put it into a very hot oven. So if your oven runs a little cold, you might want to preheat almost up to 400, get it into the oven, and then turn your oven slightly down because you want that first blast of heat to start the baking process.
And you also want that crunchy, dark brown.
Absolutely.
Coupled with that custardy middle. And if it's all kind of custardy, it might be delicious.
You need some real heat for that. Yeah. If you want to bake them in a muffin mold, it's totally fine, but I would really recommend then having a cooling rack and another sheet pan. And with oven gloves on, take the dough out. You do want to wait a minute.
So it's
to 2 minutes because you want that butter, a little bit of that butter and that sugar that was just molten hot to just slightly cool so it stays within the product. And then I would recommend almost flipping the whole thing.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you. This has
much
been
for chatting
wonderful.
with me today, Avery. And I just want to say that you are my cherry
Oh,
pie.
well, thank you. Very happy to be here.
That's it for today's show. Thank you to Plugra Premium European Style Butter for supporting today's show. Don't forget to subscribe to She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and tell your pals about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network and is recorded at CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Kerry Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Elizabeth Vogt. Our associate producer is Jenna Sadhu, and our content operations manager is Londyn Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking.